Welcome to the West Indies Files. In today's video, we'll take a closer look at the Arawaks and the Caribs, the first people to settle in the Caribbean. We'll explore their history, how they influenced the region, and how their descendants continue to play a role in Caribbean culture today. The Caribbean, an area rich in history and culture, was the birthplace of two of the most significant indigenous groups of the Americas, the Arawaks and the Caribs. These early inhabitants of the Caribbean lived long before European explorers arrived, and their civilizations thrived for centuries. Though their numbers dramatically declined following colonization, their legacy still resonates in the Caribbean today. The Arawaks, more commonly known as the Taino in the Caribbean context, were one of the first groups to settle the islands. Their origins trace back to the Orinoco River basin in modern-day Venezuela, with archaeological evidence suggesting that the Arawaks began migrating into the Caribbean around 500 BCE. They spread throughout the Greater Antilles, settling in islands such as Cuba, Hispaniola, now Haiti and the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. They were peaceful, agricultural people, skilled in farming, fishing, and the production of ceramics. The Arawaks' daily lives were centered around farming. They cultivated crops such as cassava, yucca, maize, sweet potatoes, beans, and various fruits. Cassava was especially important to them, as it was a versatile food source that could be processed into bread and other forms of sustenance. In addition to their agricultural skills, the Arawaks were adept hunters and fishermen, using tools like spears, fishing nets, and traps. Their homes, known as bohíos, were thatched roof huts made from wood, palm leaves, and other local materials. These structures were designed to be cool in the hot Caribbean climate and provided shelter for extended families. Culturally, the Arawaks placed significant importance on communal living and shared responsibilities. They had a rich spiritual life that revolved around a pantheon of gods who were believed to govern the elements and natural forces. The Arawaks also engaged in ceremonial practices such as the arito, a ritual dance that celebrated harvests, victories, and community events. Art and craftsmanship were highly valued in Arawak society, with intricate pottery, woven baskets, and hammocks being produced regularly. Their canoes, called piraguas, were used for fishing and inter-island trade, showcasing their seafaring abilities. The Caribs, a separate indigenous group, arrived in the Caribbean several centuries later, likely around 1000 CE, although some estimates suggest an earlier arrival. They are thought to have originated in the Amazon basin before migrating northward to the Lesser Antilles, particularly to islands such as Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Grenada. Unlike the Arawaks, the Caribs were known for their warrior culture, maritime skills, and aggressive defense of their territories. The Carib society was markedly different from that of the Arawaks. They were less focused on agriculture and more on fishing, hunting, and warfare. While the Arawaks were primarily farmers, the Caribs were expert sailors and hunters. Their long, narrow canoes enabled them to travel vast distances across the Caribbean Sea, and they became known for their ability to raid other islands and defend their own land from invaders. Some European sources from the 16th century describe the Caribs as cannibals, but this claim has been debated by modern historians. Many argue that while the Caribs practiced ritualistic human sacrifice in some cases, the reports of widespread cannibalism were likely exaggerated by European colonizers. The Caribs also had a distinct language and customs. Their social structures were based on a hierarchical system, with chiefs known as kings or zemis leading their people. The Caribs were less centralized than the Arawaks, with each village being independent and self-governing. This decentralized structure allowed them to resist colonization longer than their Arawak counterparts. The relationship between the Arawaks and the Caribs was not solely one of conflict, though they were rivals for territory. Evidence suggests that there were moments of both cooperation and tension between the two groups. The Caribs, being more militaristic, often clashed with the Arawaks, who were peaceful and engaged in agricultural production. Some Carib groups eventually assimilated Arawak cultural practices, including their farming techniques, as they began to spread across the Caribbean islands. The interactions between these two groups were complex. In some cases, the Caribs may have captured Arawak individuals, incorporating them into their communities. There are also accounts of the two groups trading with each other, exchanging goods like cassava and fishing tools. The arrival of Europeans, however, disrupted these interactions and led to the decline of both groups. As European powers sought to expand their colonies in the Caribbean, both the Arawaks and the Caribs found themselves increasingly threatened by foreign diseases, violence, and forced labor. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 marked the beginning of the end for the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean. The Arawaks were particularly vulnerable to European diseases such as smallpox and influenza, to which they had no immunity. Within a few decades, the Arawak population was decimated by these diseases, and many were enslaved or killed by the Spanish colonizers. The Caribs, while still heavily impacted by European settlement, put up a much stronger resistance. Some groups even fled to more remote areas of the Caribbean or migrated to parts of Central America, where they continued to survive and adapt. While the Arawak and Carib populations were drastically reduced through colonization, their legacy persists in the Caribbean today. The Garifuna people, descendants of both the Arawaks and Caribs, provide a living testament to the survival and endurance of these indigenous cultures. The Garifuna people are primarily found in Central America, particularly in countries such as Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. In the Caribbean, small Garifuna communities still thrive in places like St. Vincent, Dominica, and the Bay Islands of Honduras. They maintain their traditional language, dance, and music, including the famous Garifuna drumming. In addition to the Garifuna, many Caribbean people today carry genetic markers of their Arawak and Carib ancestors. Genetic studies have revealed that Caribbean populations in countries such as Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Dominican Republic still show significant indigenous ancestry, although it is often blended with African and European roots due to centuries of colonization, slavery, and intermarriage. The influence of the Arawaks and Caribs on modern Caribbean culture is evident in numerous ways. The Arawaks' impact on language is perhaps the most obvious, with many words used in Caribbean languages today deriving from Arawak and Taino languages. Words like hurricane, canoe, barbecue, and tobacco all have Arawak or Carib origins and are now part of the global lexicon. Culinary practices also reflect the Arawak and Carib influence. The use of cassava, a root vegetable that was central to the Arawak diet, is widespread in Caribbean cooking. Many dishes, such as cassava bread, a staple of the Arawaks, are still prepared in many Caribbean communities. Similarly, traditional fishing techniques and the use of dugout canoes for transportation and fishing have been passed down through generations. The Garifuna people continue to celebrate their mixed Arawak and Carib heritage through unique festivals, language, food, and music. In places like Belize, Honduras, and parts of the Caribbean, the Garifuna maintain their traditional ways of life, including their vibrant drumming and cultural dances. UNESCO even recognized Garifuna music and dance as part of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, reflecting the importance of preserving these traditions. Across the Caribbean, efforts to preserve and revitalize Arawak and Carib traditions are ongoing. In Dominica, the Kalinago people, descendants of the Caribs, continue to advocate for the protection of their land and culture. Various Caribbean nations support cultural preservation programs that focus on educating younger generations about indigenous heritage and ensuring that traditional arts, crafts, and languages are not lost to time. Today, the legacy of the Arawaks and Caribs is carried forward by their descendants, who continue to celebrate their cultural heritage. While colonization nearly wiped out these indigenous peoples, their descendants, through resilience, culture, and memory, have ensured that their histories are not forgotten. The Carib people now prefer to be known as the Kalinago, a name they have chosen to reclaim their identity and distance themselves from the negative stereotypes historically attached to the term Carib, such as accusations of cannibalism. The name Kalinago reflects their indigenous roots and means the people, or the true people, a term that better represents their culture and heritage. The Garifuna people, along with other indigenous Caribbean communities, are a testament to the enduring spirit of the Arawaks and Kalinago, whose cultures have left an indelible mark on the Caribbean's identity. Across the islands and communities of the Caribbean, traces of these indigenous ancestors can be found in the languages spoken, the food prepared, the rhythms played, and the land that is still home to many of their descendants. The story of the Arawaks and Kalinago is not just a chapter from the past, it remains an ongoing influence that continues to shape the vibrant culture of the Caribbean today.